good evening, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we drift back in time to explore the peculiar, often punishing, and sometimes downright poisonous world of medieval beauty. It was an era where the pinnacle of attractiveness wasn't a vibrant, healthy glow, but rather a delicate, almost ghostly pallor that suggested you hadn't seen the sun in years and were proud of it. This was a world where beauty wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a billboard advertising your social status, your piety, and your complete and utter lack of experience with manual labor. So, before we begin our journey into this curious past, I invite you to get comfortable. Take a moment to gently press the like button and perhaps subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes, but only if our quiet explorations of history are something you truly enjoy. It's always wonderful to know who is settling in with us, so feel free to leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, settle into your pillows, and let's begin. In the medieval mind, the most fundamental element of beauty was the complexion. Unlike today, where a sun-kissed tan might speak of holidays and outdoor hobbies, in the Middle Ages, it screamed of something else entirely: poverty. Tanned skin was the undeniable mark of the peasantry, of someone who toiled in the fields under the hot sun. To be beautiful, especially for a woman of the nobility, was to be pale. The paler you were, the more unequivocally you announced to the world that your life was one of leisure, spent indoors, far from the dirt and sweat of the working class. This obsession with paleness went beyond a simple preference for fair skin. The ideal was a complexion that was luminous, translucent, and almost unnervingly white. Think of the soft glow of moonlight on snow, or the delicate fragility of porcelain. Poets of the age would describe their heroines as lily-white, or pale as a pearl. This wasn't just about looking wealthy, it was about looking ethereal, as if one were more spirit than flesh, untouched by the grime and hardship of the mortal world. A faint, almost sickly pallor was the ultimate status symbol. Of course, nature rarely provides such an extreme canvas. Most people, even those who stayed indoors, had skin that was, well, skin-colored. To achieve the coveted, ghostly look, medieval women turned to cosmetics, or more accurately, to alchemy. The most popular and dangerous tool in their arsenal was a face powder made from white lead, known as ceruse. When applied to the skin, it created a thick, smooth, matte white finish that effectively erased all blemishes and natural color, providing that signature, aristocratic glow. This lead-based foundation was, as you might imagine, incredibly toxic. The ceruse was made by corroding lead metal with vinegar, then scraping off the white crust that formed. Daily application of this powder would, over time, lead to skin damage, hair loss, internal organ failure, and a slow, painful death by poisoning. Yet, for centuries, it remained the go-to cosmetic for the elite. The choice between looking like a sun-weathered peasant and slowly poisoning oneself was, for many, not a difficult one. Beauty has always demanded its sacrifices. For those unwilling or unable to procure lead, there were other, slightly less lethal options. Women would use poultices of crushed lily roots, or apply mixtures of wheat flour and egg whites to bleach their skin and create a smooth, glazed finish. Some would even wash their faces with vinegar to lighten their complexion. Veins were sometimes delicately painted onto the face, neck, and chest with a fine blue pigment to enhance the illusion of translucent skin, suggesting a delicacy so profound that one's very blood was visible beneath the surface. It was a painstaking performance of fragility. If the pale complexion was the canvas of medieval beauty, then the forehead was its grand centerpiece. Of all the trends that defined the era, perhaps none is more striking to the modern eye than the obsession with a high, smooth, and completely uninterrupted forehead. This wasn't just a fleeting fashion. It was a profound statement of intelligence, nobility, and even divinity. The ideal medieval face was structured like a gentle, sloping dome, and the forehead was the architectural marvel that held it all together. It was a look that declared, "My thoughts are lofty, my lineage is pure, and I have never once had to furrow my brow in physical effort." To achieve this celebrated look, women undertook a process of meticulous and often painful grooming that can only be described as forehead expansion. The primary targets for removal were the eyebrows. In much of medieval Europe, particularly during the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as an unsightly interruption to the smooth, serene landscape of the upper face. They were plucked, shaved, or chemically removed into near non-existence, creating a vast, unbroken expanse of skin from the eyes to the hairline. This process extended beyond just the brows. To further elongate the forehead, women would also pluck the hair from their scalp, systematically removing strands one by one to push their natural hairline further back. This wasn't a simple trim or shaping. It was a dedicated, long-term project of facial renovation. Medieval grooming manuals offered guidance on this, suggesting the use of tweezers, heated cloths, or special depilatory creams made from rather alarming concoctions, including ingredients like arsenic, cat dung, or vinegar mixtures, all in the pursuit of that coveted, high-domed appearance. The results of these efforts are immortalized in the art of the period. Portraits from the late Middle Ages frequently depict noble women with placid, serene expressions, their faces dominated by foreheads so expansive they seem to occupy nearly half the face. Combined with the requisite pale skin and delicately understated features, this aesthetic became the visual shorthand for refined and aristocratic beauty. It created a look that was simultaneously angelic and slightly alien, a face that seemed almost too perfect, too smooth to be entirely human. Fashion played a crucial role in accentuating this trend. The elaborate headwear of the time, from simple wimples and veils to the dramatic, con-shaped hennons, was designed to support the high forehead look. These coverings would often be worn in a way that pulled the hairline back, concealed any stray hairs, and framed the face to put maximum emphasis on the bare, gleaming expanse of the forehead. In essence, the clothing and grooming worked in perfect harmony to sculpt the ideal facial silhouette. This was not a fringe movement confined to a single court or region. From the halls of English castles to the palaces of Burgundy and the city-states of Italy, the high forehead was the dominant trend among the nobility. Artists reinforced it, poets praised it, and society embraced it as the ultimate marker of elegance. A woman whose face seemed to begin halfway up her head was, in the eyes of the medieval elite, the very picture of perfection. Interestingly, where dedication failed, ingenuity sometimes prevailed. For those who couldn't endure the constant plucking or afford the caustic creams, there were simpler methods. Some women would simply use makeup to conceal their brows, or use cleverly placed headbands and veils to create the illusion of a higher hairline. It was, in its own way, an early form of contouring, proving that the desire to reshape and redefine one's features is a timeless human endeavor, even if the tools and techniques have changed dramatically. In the intricate tapestry of medieval beauty, if your hair was not golden, you were already at a disadvantage. Throughout much of Europe, blonde hair was the undisputed ideal, the shimmering crown that signified youth, purity, and a kind of angelic virtue. This preference was so pervasive that it was reflected in religious art. The Virgin Mary, a woman from the Middle East, was almost universally depicted with flowing golden locks. Realism was secondary to the symbolic power of radiance. To have blonde hair was to be touched by a heavenly light, a walking embodiment of grace. If you were fortunate enough to be born a natural blonde, you held a distinct social advantage. But for the vast majority whose hair was a more common shade of brown, black, or red, achieving the ideal required intervention. Medieval women, determined to align with this standard, became amateur chemists, brewing a wide array of potent and often foul-smelling concoctions in their homes. Their goal was to strip the color from their hair and emerge with that coveted celestial shimmer, no matter the cost to its texture or their sense of smell. A popular method was known as sunbasking. A woman would apply a lightening mixture to her hair and then sit outdoors for hours, often wearing a wide-brimmed hat with the crown cut out to expose her hair to the sun while shielding her precious pale skin. The recipes for these mixtures were varied and creative. Common ingredients included saffron, chamomile, flowers, honey, and even wood ash mixed with lye. These were combed through the hair, left to bake in the sun, and then rinsed, hopefully revealing a lighter, sun-bleached shade. For a more powerful effect, some recipes called for even less savory ingredients. One of the most effective, and most startling to the modern mind, was the use of aged urine. The ammonia was a potent bleaching agent, and while the practice seems bizarre today, it was a common and effective method for lifting color from dark hair. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of beauty has often involved a willingness to endure what we would now consider utterly disgusting. As long as the result was a mane of shining gold, the process was deemed a worthy sacrifice. Beyond color, the texture and style of one's hair were also deeply significant. The ideal was long, loose, and wavy hair, cascading down the back in a shimmering curtain. However, this luxurious display was almost exclusively reserved for unmarried girls and young women. It was a symbol of their virginity and availability. To wear one's hair unbound was to be a maiden, pure and unclaimed, a walking advertisement of one's marital eligibility. The moment a woman married, this freedom vanished. Her hair, once her crowning glory, was now considered a private asset belonging to her husband, and a potential source of temptation for other men. Congratulations on your wedding. You must now banish your beautiful hair from public view. Married women were expected to bind, braid, and conceal their locks under an array of veils, wimples, nets, and caps. To show one's hair freely after marriage was seen as immodest, improper, and dangerously provocative. Even hidden from sight, a noblewoman's hair was often elaborately styled. Beneath the layers of linen and silk, hair would be intricately braided, twisted into complex knots, or woven with ribbons and jewels. These styles were a private luxury, a symbol of status that might only be seen by her husband or maids, or perhaps glimpsed through a translucent veil. It was a reminder that even when concealed from modesty, a woman's hair remained a powerful symbol of her identity and station. As a married woman's hair was banished from public life, the coverings themselves became the new canvas for fashion and status. What began as a simple requirement for modesty evolved into a competitive display of architectural headwear, especially among the nobility of the 15th century. If beauty was a language, then a woman's headdress was a declaration, shouting her wealth, prestige, and fashion-forward sensibilities from across a crowded great hall. And in this competition, taller was always better. The most iconic and wonderfully absurd example of this trend was the hennin. This is the piece of headwear that likely comes to mind when you picture a medieval princess, a tall, cone-shaped hat that resembled a fairy tale turret or a misplaced church steeple. The hennin was not merely a hat, it was a wearable skyscraper, a declaration of status so blatant that its height was often dictated by rank. The taller the cone, the higher the wearer's position in the social hierarchy, and the more careful she had to be when passing through doorways. These structures were masterpieces of medieval engineering. Crafted from fine materials like silk, velvet, or rich brocade, they were built over rigid frames of wire or wicker to maintain their sharp, aerodynamic shape. A single, sheer veil was often attached to the very tip of the cone, cascading down the back, sometimes all the way to the floor. This added a sense of mystery and movement, but also created a significant fire hazard in any room lit by candles. Practicality, as always, took a back seat to spectacle. Getting one's hair to fit beneath a hennin was a challenge in itself. It was typically braided tightly and coiled, then stuffed up into the cone's narrow interior. The popular trend of plucking the hairline was a helpful coincidence, as it created a smoother foundation for the hennin to sit upon. Wearing one required impeccable posture and a certain resignation to discomfort. They were heavy, cumbersome, and threw one's balance off, but they were the absolute height of fashion. The hennin, however, was not the only form of extravagant headwear. Different courts favored different styles. In some regions, the heart-shaped escoffion was popular, a padded roll of fabric that framed the face and curved upwards on either side, resembling two corsants artfully attached to the head. Another variation was the butterfly hennin, where the veil was not left to hang, but was stretched over a delicate wire frame behind the head, creating the illusion of ethereal wings. Naturally, such elaborate and expensive headwear was the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. The vast majority of women, peasants, merchants, wives, and artisans wore much simpler and more practical coverings. These typically consisted of linen caps, coifs, or simple cloth veils wrapped around the head and chin. Their purpose was modesty and hygiene, protecting the hair from smoke and dirt, a stark contrast to the purely ornamental function of a noblewoman's hennin. As with most extravagant fashions, the clergy and other moralists were not impressed. Conservative thinkers railed against these towering hats, denouncing them as symbols of vanity, pride, and sinful excess. They preached that such ostentatious displays invited the devil's attention and distracted from a life of piety. Yet, for those at the top of the social ladder, the allure of the hennin and its dramatic cousins was too powerful to resist, proving that even under the watchful eye of the church, fashion would always find a way to reach for the heavens. Moving down from the carefully constructed face and headwear, the ideal female body in the medieval period was, predictably, another testament to a life of leisure. The goal was not to appear athletic, toned, or strong. Instead, the most desirable figure was slender, soft, and delicate, with an air of willowy grace that suggested one might be easily toppled by a stiff breeze. This was a body that looked as if its primary form of exercise was elegantly lifting a goblet of wine, or, on a particularly strenuous day, embroidering a tapestry. This preference was, like everything else, rooted in class distinction. A body with defined muscles, broad shoulders, or strong arms was the body of a worker. A woman who carried water, churned butter, or worked in the fields. The nobility, therefore, cultivated an opposing ideal. A slender frame, narrow shoulders, and soft limbs were the physical proof that a woman had never been required to perform any labor. Her fragility was her status. It was a body built by inactivity, and that was precisely the point. The clothing of the era was designed to create and enhance this delicate silhouette. Gowns, particularly in the later Middle Ages, featured high waistlines that sat just below the bust. This style, an early precursor to the empire waist, served to elongate the torso and create a sense of graceful, flowing height. To further refine the figure, the torso of the gown or kirtle was often tightly laced, cinching the waist and smoothing the upper body. While not the rigid corsets of later centuries, these garments provided structure and control, molding the body into the fashionable shape. However, there was a crucial and interesting nuance to this ideal of slenderness. In an age where famine and disease were ever-present threats, being excessively thin was not desirable. It could signal poverty, or, worse, a deadly illness. Therefore, while the overall frame was to be slender, a slight, gentle roundness in the abdomen was considered attractive. A softly protruding stomach was not seen as a flaw, but as a sign of health, wealth, and, most importantly, fertility. It suggested that a woman was well fed and capable of bearing children. This combination created the characteristic S-curve silhouette that dominated late medieval art and fashion. The ideal figure featured a high, slender waist, a gracefully arched back, and a gently rounded belly, often pushed forward by posture and the cut of the clothing. It was a complex and contradictory ideal, a body that was at once delicate and fertile, slender and soft. This was the shape that whispered of both noble blood and the promise of heirs. The diets recommended to achieve such beauty were not about weight loss in the modern sense. Medieval beauty manuals were more concerned with the quality and supposed properties of food. They might advise eating fennel to aid digestion and maintain a slim figure, or consuming almonds and chicken, which were considered noble foods that contributed to a refined constitution. It was less about calories and more about cultivating a specific kind of aristocratic inner balance that would, in theory, be reflected in one's outward appearance. For men, the ideal was different, yet shared the same core value of refinement. A nobleman was expected to look strong, with broad shoulders and capable legs, but not like a brutish laborer. He was to have a lean, athletic build, suitable for riding and swordsmanship, but with a graceful posture that distinguished him from a common foot soldier. For both men and women, the ultimate goal was to embody an effortless, almost innate, elegance that separated them from the masses. While the dominant aesthetic was one of ghostly paleness, a completely monochrome face was not the ultimate goal. The truly fashionable ideal included a faint, subtle touch of color in the cheeks. This was not a healthy, robust flush, but rather a delicate, barely there blush, like the whisper of pink on the inside of a seashell. It was meant to suggest youth, fertility, and a gentle inner vitality, all without looking like you had made any effort whatsoever. To have a natural rosy tint was a gift. To apply it was a sin. This created a delicate social and theological tightrope for medieval women to walk. The church was deeply suspicious of cosmetics, viewing makeup or face painting as an act of vanity and deception. To alter the face God gave you was to challenge divine creation and, worse, to potentially tempt men into sinful thoughts. A woman who wore obvious rouge risked being labeled as vain, immoral, or even heretical. And so, the art of the blush was the art of plausible deniability. To achieve this subtle glow without detection, women turned to the natural world. The most common sources of rouge were found in the kitchen or the garden. The juice from crushed strawberries, mulberries, or beetroot provided a temporary stain that could be dabbed onto the cheeks. Others would use the sediment from a cask of red wine. These organic cosmetics had the advantage of looking more natural and being easier to explain away. If questioned, a woman could simply claim her flush was the result of the wind, a moment of shyness, or the heat from the hearth. For the wealthy, more potent and permanent pigments were available from apothecaries, though they often came with significant risks. Red ochre, a natural clay pigment, could be mixed with fat to create a simple cream rouge. More dangerously, some mixtures contained toxic substances, like red lead or cinnabar, a bright red mineral containing mercury. Just as with the white lead foundation, these products offered a vibrant, long-lasting color at the cost of one's health, slowly poisoning the wearer for the sake of perfectly pink-tinged cheeks. The application of blush was a delicate and often imprecise art. Mirrors were rare, small, and often made of polished metal that offered a distorted reflection at best. Most women relied on muscle memory, a trusted handmaiden's opinion, or the feel of their own fingers to apply the color. A small piece of cloth would be used to dab the pigment onto the apples of the cheeks, blending it carefully to avoid any harsh lines that might give the game away. The social stakes were high. If your blush was too bright or too perfectly applied, you could be accused of imitating the appearance of a prostitute who often wore heavy makeup as a mark of their trade. In some courts, obvious makeup was associated with foreign rivals, particularly the French, and wearing it could be seen as a sign of questionable loyalties. The goal was always modest enhancement, a look that prompted the compliment, "You have a lovely, natural color," to which the proper response was denial and a humble murmur about the weather. This subtle dance with vanity was so ingrained in the culture that it seems almost everyone participated to some degree. There are even accounts suggesting that nuns, in the privacy of their cloisters, would occasionally apply a discreet touch of color from beetroot or petals, supposedly only on major feast days. It seems that even those dedicated to a life of piety were not entirely immune to the desire for a divine and deniable glow. In the quiet, reserved world of medieval high society, where overt expression was often discouraged, a woman's eyes became her primary tool for communication. They were the silent conveyors of her virtue, her piety, and her inner emotional landscape. The ideal medieval eyes were not merely beautiful in color or shape. They were expected to be expressive in a very specific, demure way. Poets described the perfect eyes as large, clear, and shining, like luminous orbs or dewdrops of heaven, hinting at a soul full of grace and a touch of gentle, romantic melancholy. While light-colored eyes, blue or gray, were often held up as the ideal in Northern European literature. Associated with innocence and Germanic or Celtic heritage, this was not a universal rule. In the courts of Spain and Italy, dark, almond-shaped eyes were equally admired for their soulful depth and intensity. Ultimately, the expression was more important than the specific shade. The perfect gaze was one that appeared thoughtful, modest, and directed slightly downward, as if contemplating sacred mysteries rather than engaging directly with the world. Enhancing the eyes with cosmetics was a far more subtle affair than it is today. There were no neatly packaged eyeliners, mascaras, or eyeshadow palettes. However, women did use what was available. The most common substance was kohl, a fine black powder made from ground galena, antimony, or simple soot. A tiny amount would be delicately applied to the waterline or the base of the lashes to make the eyes appear larger and more defined, and to make the whites of the eyes seem brighter in contrast. It was a risky application that could easily lead to irritation or an accidental, smudgy mess. For most, the art of beautiful eyes was less about makeup and more about behavior. A virtuous woman was expected to keep a modest, downcast gaze at all times, especially in the presence of men. Looking directly at someone was considered bold and improper. The ideal was to glance up fleetingly from beneath lowered lashes, a gesture that was seen as both modest and alluring. This practice of looking at the floor might have been good for the soul, but it was likely responsible for countless trips over unseen furniture and sleeping dogs. Interestingly, a certain moistness or a slightly teary quality in the eyes was also considered attractive. It suggested a sensitive, pious nature, as if the woman had just been moved by prayer or a particularly beautiful piece of music. While artificial tears were centuries away, this look could be achieved through genuine emotion, a well-timed yawn, or perhaps by strategically standing in the path of smoke from a nearby fireplace. It added to the overall aesthetic of delicate spiritual fragility. The removal of the eyebrows, as we've discussed, played a crucial role in emphasizing the eyes. With no brows to frame them from above, the eyes became the dominant feature on the upper face. This stark, uninterrupted landscape drew all attention to the gaze itself, making it appear more prominent and expressive within the smooth, pale canvas of the skin. Every subtle flicker of the lashes or gentle shift of the gaze was magnified. In essence, the perfect medieval eyes were a performance of piety. They were meant to be windows not just to the soul, but to a very specific kind of soul, one that was humble, chaste, and full of quiet contemplation. It was a look that said very little, and in doing so, said everything about a woman's place in the medieval world. Let us now turn to an aspect of beauty rarely lingered upon in romantic medieval poetry, the mouth. While a troubadour might write endless verses about his lady's rosebud lips, he conveniently omitted any description of her breath or the state of her teeth. That's because medieval oral hygiene was, to put it mildly, an afterthought. In a world without toothbrushes, fluoride, or modern dentistry, a pleasant smile and fresh breath were less of a standard and more of a happy accident. Still, the ideal existed. Sweet-smelling breath was certainly considered desirable, as it hinted at youth, cleanliness, and a delicate constitution. But achieving it was a daily struggle against a diet heavy in staples like coarse bread, preserved fish, onions, and garlic. The concept of minty freshness was centuries away, so people had to improvise with whatever nature and the spice trade could provide, hoping to mask the inevitable odors of daily life. To combat bad breath, medieval men and women would chew on a variety of aromatic herbs and spices. Parsley, mint, and fennel seeds were popular choices, as were more expensive imported spices, like cloves and cinnamon sticks. These acted as primitive breath fresheners, their strong flavors temporarily overpowering less pleasant smells. Think of it as carrying a small herb garden in your pocket. Some also used mouth rinses made from vinegar, wine, or myrrh, which had antiseptic properties, but would have been incredibly harsh on the mouth. When it came to teeth, the standard was simple. White, even teeth were beautiful. The reality, however, was grim. Tooth decay was rampant, and by the time a person reached adulthood, they were likely to have teeth that were stained, chipped, or missing entirely. Dental care was virtually non-existent, and any surgery usually involved a blacksmith, a pair of pliers, and no anesthetic. Consequently, a full set of healthy teeth was an incredible rarity, a true mark of fortune and good genes. People did make an effort to clean their teeth, though their methods were abrasive at best. The most common practice was to rub the teeth vigorously with a piece of rough linen cloth. To aid in this polishing, various powders were used. These could be made from salt, chalk, or powdered sage. The wealthy might use more exotic ingredients, like crushed coral or pearl. While these might have scrubbed away some surface stains, they also wore down the tooth enamel, likely causing more harm than good in the long run. Given the general state of dental health, it's no surprise that the modern, wide, toothy grin was not a feature of medieval social interaction. The fashionable expression was a small, demure, closed-lip smile. This was partly a matter of modesty, as opening one's mouth too wide was considered unladylike, but it was also a very practical way of concealing a less than perfect set of teeth. The goal was to look pleasantly contemplative, not overtly thrilled. Ultimately, while perfect teeth and breath were appreciated, their absence was not shocking. Halitosis was simply a fact of life, and in a world grappling with plague, famine, and warfare, a bit of bad breath was low on the list of concerns. A conversation might be held at a polite distance, and a lady might hold a scented handkerchief or pomander near her nose, but a flawed smile would not necessarily ruin one's prospects. After all, everyone was more or less in the same boat. While the pressures of medieval beauty standards fell most heavily on women, men were by no means exempt from their own set of aesthetic expectations. For a nobleman, his appearance was a critical component of his identity, a reflection of his power, lineage, and sophistication. The ideal man was not expected to be merely handsome. He was expected to look the part of a ruler. This meant striking a careful balance between martial strength and courtly refinement, looking as if he could command an army, but would prefer to compose a sonnet. The ideal male physique was tall, lean, and broad-shouldered. This was the body of a man trained in horsemanship and swordsmanship, but not one hardened by manual labor. Overtly bulky muscles were often seen as coarse and common, the mark of a peasant or a stonemason. A nobleman's strength was meant to appear graceful and inherent, visible in his confident posture and the elegant way he carried himself, rather than in bulging biceps. His body was a weapon, but a refined and polished one. Facial features followed a similar pattern of noble definition. A strong, straight nose, a defined jawline, and high cheekbones were all considered hallmarks of aristocratic good looks, the kind of features immortalized in the portraits of kings and princes. As for facial hair, fashions varied by decade and region. A neatly trimmed, well-groomed beard could signify wisdom and authority, while a smooth, clean-shaven face might suggest youth and purity. The one constant was that it had to be deliberate. A patchy, untended beard was a sign of negligence or low status. A nobleman's hair was also an important part of his presentation. While monks were tonsured and peasants might have their hair cropped for practicality, aristocratic men often wore their hair longer, sometimes falling to the shoulders in carefully styled waves or curls. In some courts, particularly in the later medieval period, natural-looking curls were highly prized. Some men even resorted to using heated tongs to style their hair or used special herbal rinses to enhance its texture and shine, proving vanity was an equal opportunity pursuit. Clothing was essential in crafting the ideal male silhouette. Tunics, and later, doublets, were often tailored to create a strong V-shape, sometimes with padding in the shoulders to broaden the frame. Belts were worn low on the hips or cinched tightly at the waist to emphasize a lean torso. And of course, there was the hose, the tight-fitting leggings that showcased a pair of well-shaped legs, which were considered a particularly attractive masculine feature. A nobleman was not supposed to appear as if he spent hours preening in front of a mirror. Even if he did, his attractiveness was supposed to be a natural extension of his blue blood. He didn't try to be appealing, he simply was, by virtue of his birthright. This performance of nonchalant elegance was a key part of the courtly game, whether through his erect posture, the fine fabric of his clothes, or the confident set of his jaw. A medieval lord's appearance was a constant, silent reminder to everyone around him that he was born to be in charge. It was a look that was less about attracting a mate and more about commanding a room. In an age before modern plumbing, daily showers, and deodorant, managing the simple reality of human scent was an art form in itself. While popular myth sometimes paints the Middle Ages as a time when everyone simply ignored foul odors, the truth is far more complex. People were acutely aware of smell, and a pleasant personal scent was highly valued as a sign of cleanliness, wealth, and refinement. Smelling good, however, required a constant and creative battle against the body's natural state. Bathing was more common than many believe, but it was certainly not a daily ritual. For the wealthy, private baths were a luxury, but for most, bathing involved heating large quantities of water, a labor-intensive process. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, but they were often associated with immoral behavior and later with the spread of disease, leading the church to frown upon them. This meant that for days or even weeks between full baths, people relied on other methods to stay fresh. The most important weapon in this fragrant war was the pomander. This was a small, often beautifully crafted, hollow ball of metal, like silver or gold, with perforated designs. It was worn on a chain around the neck or attached to a belt. Inside this little orb, a person would place a mixture of powerful, pleasant-smelling substances. As they moved, the pomander would release a small cloud of fragrance, creating a personal bubble of scented air to ward off the less pleasant smells of the medieval world. The contents of a pomander varied by wealth and preference. A common mixture might include dried herbs like rosemary, lavender, and sage, mixed with pungent spices such as cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. The very rich could afford more exotic and potent ingredients, like ambergris, a waxy substance from whales, or musk, derived from animal glands. These were not just perfumes, they were status symbols, their expensive scents announcing the owner's wealth to every nose in the room. Scent was not confined to pomanders. The nobility perfumed nearly everything. Gloves were frequently scented with floral oils, handkerchiefs were dusted with fragrant powders, and even rosary beads were sometimes carved from aromatic wood. Clothing was stored in wooden chests with sachets of dried lavender or rose petals to keep it smelling sweet. Hair, prone to absorbing the smoky smells of medieval interiors, would be rinsed with rosewater or infusions of herbs to cleanse it and leave a lingering fragrance. When a full bath was not possible, a form of dry cleaning was practiced. A person would wipe themselves down with a clean linen cloth, sometimes dampened with scented water. While this did little to remove bacteria, it provided a temporary feeling of freshness. The most important layer of hygiene was the undergarment, a linen shift or shirt worn against the skin. Linen was more easily washed than heavy outer garments of wool or velvet, and these shifts were changed as frequently as possible to absorb sweat and keep odors away from the expensive outer layers. Ultimately, the medieval approach to scent was less about eliminating body odor and more about masking it. It was a strategy of fragrant camouflage. To smell good was to surround oneself with a symphony of pleasant aromas from herbs, spices, and flowers, creating a personal atmosphere so powerful that it overshadowed everything else. It was a constant effort, a testament to the fact that even centuries ago, people understood the subtle power of a pleasant scent. Beyond the powders, pluckers, and perfumes, the most complex aspect of medieval beauty was its deep entanglement with morality. In the medieval world, a person's face was never just a face. It was a text to be read, a potential indicator of their spiritual health and social worth. To be beautiful was to walk a treacherous path between being seen as divinely blessed and dangerously sinful. And the line between the two was perilously thin. On one hand, physical beauty was often interpreted as a gift from God, an outward manifestation of an individual's inner virtue. Clear skin, symmetrical features, and a graceful bearing were thought to reflect a pure soul, untouched by corruption. Poets and theologians alike often connected physical loveliness with spiritual grace. In this view, a beautiful person was a living example of God's perfect creation, and their appearance was a pleasant and reassuring sign of order in a chaotic world. However, the moment a person acknowledged or actively pursued this beauty, they stumbled into the territory of sin. Vanity, or pride in one's appearance, was one of the 7 deadly sins, and the Church was relentless in its condemnation of it. Using cosmetics, spending lavishly on fashionable clothing, or admiring oneself in a mirror were all seen as signs of a corrupt soul, one that valued earthly charms over heavenly salvation. To try to be beautiful was to admit you weren't content with the face God gave you, a dangerously prideful stance to take. For women, this paradox was even more pronounced. A woman's beauty was often framed as a potential weapon of the devil, a snare to tempt good men into lustful thoughts and sinful acts. Drawing on the biblical story of Eve, medieval sermons frequently warned men to be wary of beautiful women whose charming appearances could mask a deceptive and dangerous nature. The blame for any temptation was placed squarely on the woman herself, making her beauty not a gift but a liability she had to constantly manage. This mindset had real social consequences. A woman who was deemed too fashionable, who wore her gown too tightly, or whose blush was a shade too noticeable, could find herself the subject of vicious gossip or public condemnation. She could be accused of being immoral, of using her appearance to manipulate men, or of practicing deception. In a society where reputation was everything, such accusations could be ruinous. Conversely, a lack of beauty could also be interpreted through a moral lens. while not as dangerous as being too beautiful. Physical plainness or deformities were sometimes seen as a sign of divine disfavor, or, in a darker interpretation, a reflection of a flawed character. Ugliness could be linked to sin, illness, or a base, peasant nature. This created an impossible standard where one had to be naturally beautiful without being vain, and pleasing to the eye without being tempting. In the end, medieval beauty standards forced women, particularly those of the nobility, to navigate a constant, nerve-wracking performance. The goal was to embody an ideal of effortless, God-given beauty, all while meticulously plucking, powdering, and pinching themselves in private. It was a full-time job with impossibly high stakes, where your face could be seen as a reflection of your soul, and a single misplaced brush of rouge could be interpreted as a step toward damnation. And so, we leave the powdered, plucked, and pious world of medieval Europe. Our journey now takes us further back in time and further east to the arid plains of ancient Persia. Here, in the heart of the sprawling Achaemenid Empire, a different kind of aesthetic reigned, one defined not by delicate fragility, but by unshakable discipline, imperial might, and the terrifying beauty of absolute order. This ideal was perfectly embodied by one of the most legendary military units in all of history, the 10,000 Immortals. The Immortals were more than just an elite royal guard. They were a living, marching symbol of the Persian Empire's core philosophy. Their story begins in the 6th century BCE with the empire's founder, Cyrus the Great, as he forged a vast dominion stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. Cyrus understood that an empire is held together by more than just laws and governors. It needs a symbol of its power, a force that projects dominance and inspires both awe and fear. From this need, the Immortals were born. Their famous name was not a claim of supernatural power, but a masterful piece of psychological warfare and logistical brilliance. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the unit's strength was always kept at precisely 10,000 men. If a soldier fell in battle, succumbed to illness, or retired, he was immediately replaced. From the perspective of their enemies, their numbers never dwindled. They were a constant, unending wave of force. To face them was to face an army that seemingly could not be diminished, a unit that could not die. This concept of collective immortality was their greatest weapon. The individual soldier was secondary to the whole. This was not a place for personal glory or heroic individualism. To be an immortal was to be a perfectly functioning part of an eternal machine. These were not random conscripts. They were handpicked from the highest echelons of Persian society, chosen from noble families in Persia, Media, and Elam for their loyalty, strength, and unwavering discipline. Training for this elite corps began in childhood. Boys were taught to ride, to shoot a bow with deadly accuracy, and, most importantly, to endure hardship and obey orders without question. They were molded into exemplars of Persian values: order, duty, and absolute loyalty to the King of Kings. Their very existence was a political statement, a promise of the empire's endurance. When they marched, they were a spectacle of regulated splendor. They wore richly colored tunics over a layer of flexible scale armor, carrying a spear, a bow, and a short sword. Their shields, made of woven wicker, were light and maneuverable. Their appearance was as carefully calculated as their battle tactics, designed to present an image of both regal wealth and deadly efficiency. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Ionia, The Immortals were the ever-present backbone of Persian authority. They stood guard at the palace gates in Persepolis. They marched at the vanguard of imperial campaigns, and they crushed rebellions with cold, silent precision. To see their perfectly ordered ranks approaching on the horizon was to witness the arrival of the empire itself, relentless, unchanging, and eternal. The appearance of the Persian Immortals on the battlefield was a masterclass in psychological stagecraft. This was not an army that aimed to dazzle with the glint of individual bronze armor, like their Greek rivals. Instead, their power came from a chilling uniformity, an overwhelming visual rhythm that spoke of a collective, inhuman level of discipline. To see them advance was to see an idea in motion, the idea of perfect, unending order. They were dressed in a manner that blended regal splendor with battlefield function. The outer garment was a richly embroidered tunic and trousers, often dyed in the deep reds, purples, and yellows that signified nobility and imperial authority. Beneath these fine fabrics lay their primary protection, a corselet of scale armor. This consisted of hundreds of small, overlapping plates of bronze or iron sewn onto a leather or linen backing, creating a flexible defense that protected the torso while allowing for a full range of movement. Perhaps their most distinctive feature was their headwear. Unlike the heavy, crested helmets of the Greeks, the Immortals wore a soft, felt cap known as a tiara. This cap could be pulled forward to partially obscure the face, masking the individual identity of the soldier and reinforcing the terrifying image of a single, faceless entity. This anonymity was a powerful tool. It suggested that these were not men with families, fears, and hopes. They were merely 10,000 identical instruments of the king's will. Each immortal was a versatile warrior, armed for any situation. Their primary weapon was a short spear, balanced with a metal counterweight at the base, often a silver or golden pomegranate for elite companies, which allowed it to be used for both thrusting and as a support. They also carried a large composite bow and a quiver filled with deadly arrows, making them a formidable ranged force. For close quarters combat, a short sword or dagger, known as an akinex, was worn at their side. Their shields were also unique. Instead of heavy, solid shields of wood and bronze, they carried large rectangular shields made of woven wicker, known as a sptera. While this might seem like a fragile defense, these wicker shields were deceptively effective. They were lightweight, which reduced fatigue on long marches, and their flexible structure was excellent at absorbing the energy of an impact and trapping enemy arrows. On the battlefield, they could be planted in the ground to form a defensive wall, a sparabera, from behind which the archers could unleash devastating volleys. Imagine the sight: 10,000 men moving in near-perfect synchronicity, their colorful robes creating a flowing river of imperial power. There were no loud war cries, no chaotic boasting. There was only the rhythmic tramp of their feet, the soft rustle of their wicker shields, and the silent, coordinated drawing of 10,000 bowstrings. It was an aesthetic of dread, a beautiful and terrifying spectacle designed to break an enemy's spirit long before the first spear was thrown. To be an immortal was not simply a profession. It was a lifelong surrender of the self to the state. While the position came with great honor and material reward, the life was one of relentless discipline and constant scrutiny. These men were revered, but they were also owned. Their food, their clothing, and their housing were all provided by the Persian throne, not as a kindness, but as a mechanism of absolute control. From the moment they joined the ranks, they belonged not to their families, but to the empire. Their lives were governed by a strict and unyielding routine. A day for an immortal began before dawn, with silent drills designed to perfect their synchronized movements. Hours were spent on the meticulous maintenance of their weapons and armor. A tarnished spearhead or a loose armor scale was not just a practical failure, but a sign of weak discipline. There was no room for personal glory or individual flair. The formation was sacred, and unity was valued above all else. Even their meals were a reflection of this philosophy. Food was eaten communally and was always simple, but nutritionally calculated for maximum physical endurance. Staples included flatbread, dates, a controlled ration of meat and wine. Luxuries were intentionally discouraged by the state. The empire required hardened, resilient warriors, not pampered aristocrats, softened by excessive comfort. Their diet was fuel for the imperial machine, nothing more. When not on a military campaign, the immortals served as the personal guards of the king and his court. This was no mere ceremonial duty. They were the ever-present, silent enforcers of the king's will. Stationed in the palaces at Susa or Persepolis, they monitored the ambitious nobility for any whisper of disloyalty. They thwarted assassination attempts, and they maintained a chilling sense of order in the most powerful, and therefore most volatile, places in the empire. Their presence alone was enough to silence dissent. Interestingly, they were not entirely cut off from a personal life. Immortals were permitted to marry and raise families, maintaining households that were also supported by the state. However, this was a conditional privilege. Their absolute and unwavering allegiance was to the king. When duty called, whether for a surprise campaign or a sudden deployment, they were expected to leave everything behind without a moment's hesitation or a single question. A man who faltered, who showed fear, or whose loyalty was cast into even the slightest doubt, would be quietly and efficiently removed from the ranks. The system that made them immortal was unforgiving. There could be no gaps, no delays, no sign of weakness. His replacement, already trained and waiting in the wings, would step into his place, and the great machine would move forward as if nothing had ever happened. Thus, the Immortals did not just fight with discipline, they lived and breathed it. They were instruments of the empire, honed and polished by a system that deliberately erased individuality until nothing remained but perfect, unwavering duty. Their life was a continuous, waking ritual of obedience, a testament to the awesome and terrifying power of the Persian state. If Cyrus the Great was the architect of the Immortals, it was Darius the Great who honed them into the perfect instrument of imperial power. When Darius seized the Persian throne in 522 BCE, the empire was racked by instability and widespread rebellion. He needed more than an army to restore order. He needed a symbol of absolute, unchallengeable authority. The Immortals became that symbol. Under his reign, they were elevated from an elite guard to a core pillar of his imperial administration. Darius understood the power of spectacle. He didn't just deploy the Immortals in battle. He wove them into the very fabric of his kingship. They were paraded in magnificent processions during state festivals, their disciplined ranks a stark contrast to the chaotic world outside the palace walls. He had them stationed prominently throughout his grand new capital of Persepolis, their silent, watchful presence, a constant reminder to ambitious nobles and foreign envoys of where true power lay. Beyond their symbolic role, Darius also refined their tactical purpose. He was a master strategist who valued combined arms warfare, and he trained the Immortals to be the versatile heart of his army. They were no longer just elite infantry. They drilled relentlessly to coordinate their movements with cavalry charges, to support archer volleys, and to hold the line in complex, multifaceted assaults. Under Darius, they became a more flexible, more intelligent, and therefore more deadly fighting force. This enhanced capability was put to frequent use. Darius's vast empire was in a near constant state of unrest, with provinces from Egypt to Ionia rising in rebellion. The Immortals were often the first wave of the imperial response. Their arrival in a rebellious territory was both a military action and a political message. They moved with terrifying speed and efficiency, crushing dissent not with brute force, but with methodical, surgical precision. Their presence was a clear statement. The empire is watching, and the king's will is inexorable. It was during this period that the Immortals earned their darker reputation. They were not just celebrated heroes, but also feared instruments of retribution. To face the Immortals was to face the king's wrath in its purest form, impersonal, inevitable, and absolute. Their name became synonymous, not just with military excellence, but with the chilling certainty of imperial justice. Darius immortalized them in stone. The magnificent relief carvings on the walls of Persepolis depict the Immortals in endless, perfect procession. Each soldier is rendered with stylized uniformity, the same beard, the same robes, the same spear, held at the same angle. These were not meant to be realistic portraits. They were propaganda, designed to convey the idea of an eternal, unchanging guard, a force that would serve the king into eternity. Under Darius, the Immortals transcended their role as a mere military unit. They became an institution, a living extension of the throne itself. They were the embodiment of imperial order, the silent, golden shadow that followed the King of Kings, ensuring that his rule was not only respected, but absolute. The Persian Immortals reached the zenith of their legend and faced their most formidable trial during the reign of Darius's son, Xerxes the Great. And nowhere was their fearsome reputation put to the test more intensely than at a narrow coastal pass in Greece known as Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates. In the year 480 BCE, this battle was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of worlds, pitting the centralized, orderly might of the Persian Empire against the fierce, defiant independence of the Greek city-states. When Xerxes launched his massive invasion of Greece, he brought the Immortals as his personal vanguard. They were the jewel in the crown of his colossal army, the living embodiment of Persian power. Their reputation alone was a weapon. The Greeks had long heard tales of the 10,000 who could not be killed, the king's elite who fought with flawless, terrifying precision. At Thermopylae, this legend would meet its match in the form of a few thousand Greeks, led by the Spartan king Leonidas. For 2 days, Xerxes threw wave after wave of his regular troops against the small Greek force defending the pass. And for 2 days, the Greeks held their ground, their interlocking bronze shields and long spears creating an unbreakable wall of defiance. Frustrated and enraged, Xerxes finally decided to play his ultimate card. He ordered the Immortals to advance, confident that his elite unit would succeed where all others had failed and crush the stubborn Greeks in a single, overwhelming assault. What followed, however, was not the swift victory the Persian king had envisioned. The very geography that had aided the Greek defense now hampered the Immortals. In the tight confines of the pass, Their superior numbers meant little, and their formidable bows were rendered nearly useless. Their shorter spears struggled to find a mark against the longer dory spears of the disciplined Spartan hoplites, who fought as a single, cohesive unit. For hours, the finest soldiers of the Persian Empire clashed with the hardened warriors of Sparta in a brutal, grinding stalemate. For the first time in their storied history, the Immortals appeared vulnerable. The Greek historian Herodotus, perhaps with a touch of satisfaction, noted that they suffered heavy casualties and fared no better than the troops who had come before them. This was more than a military setback. It was a crack in the very foundation of their mythos. The illusion of their invincibility, so carefully cultivated for generations, was being chipped away by Spartan bronze. On the bloody ground of Thermopylae, the world saw that the Immortals could, in fact, bleed. They could be pushed back. They could die. The divine aura that surrounded them began to dissipate under the relentless pressure of Greek shields and the grim reality of close-quarters combat. Their silk and splendor were no match for the raw, disciplined fury of men defending their homeland. Yet, even in this moment of struggle, they remained a terrifying force. They did not break, they did not flee, they adapted, they regrouped, and they continued to fight with the cold discipline that had been drilled into them since childhood. After all, their name was not a promise of individual invincibility. It was a promise of endurance, a promise that for every one who fell, another would be there to take his place. The most compelling aspect of the Persian Immortals was not their skill in battle, but the brilliant, cold-hearted system that sustained them. What truly made them immortal was not divine favor or a secret magic. It was administration. It was the methodical, relentless, and deeply impressive bureaucracy of the Achaemenid Empire that gave the unit its legendary power of endurance. At its core, the system was simple in concept and staggering in its execution. When an immortal was lost, whether in the heat of battle, to disease on a long campaign, or through honorable retirement, another fully trained soldier was promoted from a reserve pool to take his place. The transition was immediate and seamless. There was no public ceremony, no period of mourning for the fallen individual. The unit's strength remained at exactly 10,000. The machine never paused. To make this possible, the Persian military maintained a constant, dedicated pool of trainees and reserves. These were young men, often the sons of existing immortals or other noble families, who were being groomed for service. They were kept in the imperial capitals, like Susa or Persepolis, undergoing the same brutal training and indoctrination as the active duty soldiers. They were the understudies, waiting in the wings for their moment to step onto the stage of war. This entire process was managed by a sophisticated command structure. The Immortals were divided into 10 regiments of 1,000 men, each commanded by a Hazarapates, or commander of 1,000. These commanders, along with a web of subordinate officers, scribes, and quartermasters, kept meticulous records. They tracked personnel, managed supply lines, and ensured that every soldier was properly armed and provisioned. It was this organizational backbone that allowed the replacement system to function flawlessly across a vast empire. Imagine the system in action. A skirmish on the distant Egyptian frontier claims the life of an immortal. A swift message is dispatched back to the heart of the empire. Before the news has even settled, a replacement from the reserve pool is given his marching orders. He travels to join the unit, and the line is made whole again. To an outside observer, nothing has changed. The number never wavers. The psychological effect of this was profound. It fostered a sense of futility in their enemies. What was the point of killing one of these soldiers if another identical one immediately stepped forward to fill the void? It didn't matter who the man was. His individual identity was irrelevant. The presence of the unit was eternal. It was like fighting a hydra made of discipline and silk. For every head cut off, another grew in its place. This system of replacement wasn't just for battlefield casualties. An immortal who became politically unreliable, whose family fell out of favor with the king, or who simply grew too old for service, was also quietly and efficiently removed. The purity and loyalty of the unit were paramount. Their greatest strength was not their spears or their bows, but the cold, mathematical certainty that they, as a collective, could never truly be broken. While the Persian Immortals are remembered as warriors, they were often something far more subtle: diplomats in armor. In the grand strategy of the Achaemenid Empire, military power was not just for conquering, it was for demonstrating presence. The Immortals were frequently deployed not to wage war, but to be seen, entering foreign courts and provincial capitals as living, breathing monuments to Persian elegance and inescapable power. When Persian ambassadors traveled to negotiate with Greek city-states or Indian kingdoms, a small honor guard of Immortals often accompanied them. Their role was not merely protection, it was performance. Imagine the effect. 10 or 20 of these soldiers entering a foreign city, not in blood-stained battle gear, but in their fine, embroidered robes. They would move with perfect, silent synchronization, their faces unreadable, their gilded spear butts glinting in the sun. They didn't need to make threats. Their very existence was a negotiation. Within the vast borders of the empire itself, in the provinces known as satrapies, the Immortals served as a constant, quiet reminder of where ultimate authority resided. A small garrison might be stationed in a regional capital, living separately from the local populace. They rarely interfered in civil administration, but they were always there, watching. The mere possibility of their intervention was enough to discourage ambitious governors and prevent local unrest from boiling over into full-blown rebellion. At the royal court, their presence was multifunctional. During grand festivals like Nowruz, the Persian New Year, or at diplomatic receptions, they served a ceremonial role, lining the halls of the palace in their thousands. They were the magnificent, yet deadly, backdrop to the king's power. But behind the pageantry, their function was more serious. They acted as a form of internal intelligence, monitoring the intrigues of courtiers and ensuring the king's safety with an unwavering, silent vigilance. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was a part of their genius. Unlike many elite units of the ancient world, who existed solely for the glory of the battlefield, the Immortals served a much broader imperial strategy. The Achaemenid Empire was held together as much by symbols as it was by swords. And the Immortals were the ultimate symbol, a force that was as mesmerizing in peace as it was terrifying in war. They understood that fear and awe are two sides of the same coin. Their disciplined silence in a foreign court could be more intimidating than the war cries of 1,000 lesser soldiers. Their purpose was to project an aura of such profound and sophisticated power that it made resistance seem not only dangerous but also foolishly uncivilized. In this way, the Immortals fought countless battles without ever unsheathing their blades. They waged a constant war of perception, using their disciplined presence and regal appearance to communicate a simple, unyielding message to every corner of the known world. The king is watching. The empire is eternal, and resistance is not worth the cost. All empires, no matter how grand, eventually face the twilight. So too did the legend of the Persian Immortals. By the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the name still commanded respect, but the flawless, terrifying institution behind it had begun to decay, not from external defeat, but from a slow, creeping rot within. The great machine that had once seemed eternal began to rust. As successive Persian kings grew more consumed by the luxuries and intrigues of the court, their connection to the military foundations of their power weakened. The Immortals, once the hardened vanguard of the empire, began to transition from battlefield necessities to ceremonial ornaments. They still wore the splendid uniforms and marched in perfect formation. But the spirit that had once animated the ranks had started to fade. This decay had practical consequences. The rigorous recruitment standards that had defined the unit began to slip. Political favoritism started to seep into the selection process. Where once only the most disciplined and loyal men were chosen, now the sons of powerful nobles could find a place in the sacred 10,000 through influence rather than merit. The result was a unit that possessed the form of discipline, but lacked the unyielding heart of its predecessors. This decline became tragically apparent when a new power rose in the West. In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedon launched his audacious invasion of the Persian Empire, and his ruthlessly efficient war machine would prove to be the final test for the aging Persian Guard. The stage was set for a clash between a rising legend and a fading one. The final, decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE here. The Immortals were positioned at the center of the Persian line, tasked with defending their king, Darius III. They fought with the courage of their ancestors, but they could not hold back the tide. Alexander's tactical brilliance and the unstoppable momentum of the Macedonian phalanx overwhelmed them. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and, for the first time on such a grand scale, decisively broken. This defeat was more than just a military loss. It was the shattering of a myth. For centuries, the name Immortals had inspired awe. But at Gaugamela, the world saw that they were no longer what they had been. The administrative system of instant replacement, the very source of their legend, had faltered under the pressures of a failing empire. Their losses were no longer invisible. They were permanent. When Alexander the Great marched victoriously into the grand capital of Persepolis, the Immortals were not there to make a final, glorious stand. The once unbroken line had been severed for good. The empire they had symbolized was crumbling around them, and their own time had come to an end. The unit was disbanded, its name and splendor fading into the pages of history. Yet, even in their fall, they left behind a powerful legacy, a blueprint for how to build not just an army, but a legend. Though the Persian Immortals themselves vanished from the stage of history, their legend never truly died. It echoed through the centuries, a powerful story of discipline and order that lodged itself in the minds of generals, kings, and storytellers. Their influence endured, not because they won every battle, but because they represented something larger than themselves, the perfection of state-controlled power, an army that did not appear to age, question, or falter. The Greeks, who were both their rivals and their most famous chroniclers, wrote of them with a potent mixture of awe and suspicion. When Herodotus named them immortals, It wasn't because he believed they could not be killed, but because they could not be seen to die. To the Greek mind, accustomed to celebrating the individual hero, this faceless, collective discipline was both eerie and unnatural. The immortals were something else entirely, precise, silent, and disciplined, to the very edge of humanity. This powerful idea resonated long after the Achaemenid Empire had fallen. Roman scholars still referenced the Persian elite guard when discussing the great powers of antiquity. Even Byzantine historians, many centuries later, noted the structure and discipline of the immortals as a model to be admired. In the early Islamic period, Arab historians recounted tales of the 10,000 who had once guarded the ancient kings of Persia, their spears glinting like a forest of silver under the desert sun. The concept was even revived more directly. In the later Sasanian Empire of Persia, a new elite cavalry corps was formed, a unit so formidable that modern historians often refer to them as the new immortals. Though not a direct continuation of the original unit, they carried the same torch, embodying the ideal of imperial invincibility and serving as the armored fist of their empire. Centuries later, even Napoleon Bonaparte would study Persian military organization, impressed by its structure and efficiency. In more recent times, the immortals have been reimagined in popular culture, often as masked, monstrous assassins. But the truth was always far more compelling. They were not demons or magicians. They were terrifyingly human, ordinary men transformed into perfect instruments of empire through relentless training and psychological conditioning. Their greatest weapon, in the end, was not their spear. It was the idea they represented. It was the story of an eternal, unstoppable force, a shadow on the horizon that was always coming. And so, the immortals live on, not in flesh and blood, but in stone carvings, in military doctrines, and in the whispered understanding that when power is perfectly organized and endlessly replaced, it can become something very close to immortal. The immortals represented one ideal of martial aesthetics, a masculine vision of perfect, state-controlled order. But history offers other, wilder models of power. Now, we turn our gaze to the wind-swept plains of Eurasia, where, long before the legends of Greek Amazons, the Scythian people roamed. In this nomadic warrior culture, the ideals of strength and ferocity were not confined to men. Here, women rode to war. Before there were stories of the Amazons, there were the Scythians, a collection of fierce nomadic tribes who dominated the steppes from the Black Sea to the mountains of Mongolia for centuries. Unlike the settled, agricultural societies of Greece and Persia, where women's roles were largely domestic, Scythian women lived a life of mobility and conflict. They rode horses with expert skill, wielded powerful composite bows, and did not hesitate to go into battle. They didn't just accompany the men. They fought, led, and died as warriors in their own right. The ancient Greeks, encountering this culture, were stunned. The historian Herodotus wrote of Scythian tribes where women were expected to kill an enemy in combat before they were permitted to marry. His accounts, once dismissed by some as exotic fantasy, are now seen as the likely origin of the Greek myths about the Amazons, a warrior society comprised entirely of women. But where the Amazons of myth were a fantasy, the Scythian warrior woman was a reality. In recent decades, archaeology has provided astonishing proof. Across the vast grasslands of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, burial mounds known as kurgans have been excavated, revealing the graves of Scythian nobility. Inside, archaeologists have found the skeletons of women buried with the full regalia of a warrior: bronze-tipped arrows, iron swords, daggers, and the horse harnesses that were essential to their way of life. These were not symbolic offerings. They were the personal possessions of the deceased. One of the most famous discoveries revealed the remains of a young woman buried with her bow and a quiver of arrows. An arrowhead was found lodged in her spine, a clear battle wound that likely caused her death. Another grave contained a woman whose skull had been crushed by a battle axe. These finds paint a vivid picture of women who lived and died by the sword, their bodies bearing the brutal evidence of a warrior's life. This reality was born from the harsh necessities of life on the steppe. In a nomadic society, constantly on the move and vulnerable to raids, everyone, male or female, had to be a capable defender. Girls were trained in archery and horsemanship from a young age, learning the skills essential for both hunting and warfare. They wore practical leather trousers and tunics, often indistinguishable from the men's, making them a blur of deadly efficiency on horseback. While the myths spun by the Greeks created a fantastical image of the Amazons, the truth of the Scythian women is far more compelling. They were not a separate tribe of man-hating warriors. They were an integral part of a society where survival demanded that strength, skill, and courage were not defined by gender. For centuries, they galloped across the plains, a real and formidable force, their arrows flying as true as any man's. The Scythians offer a powerful glimpse into a world where warrior women were an integral part of nomadic life. But they were not the only example. Let us now journey forward in time to the 18th and 19th centuries, and to the small but formidable West African kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now modern-day Benin. Here, an entire army of women once struck terror into the hearts of European colonizers and rival African kingdoms alike. They were known as the Aguji, but the French, reaching for a familiar myth, nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazons. These were no militia or ceremonial guard. By the height of their power, the Aguji were a formal, standing army, an elite infantry corps numbering in the thousands. They served as the personal bodyguards of the king of Dahomey, but their role extended far beyond the palace. They were frontline shock troops, deployed in raids, ambushes, and major battles. Their origins may lie in groups of royal wives who served as elephant hunters, but over time they evolved into one of the most feared military forces on the continent. Joining the Aguji offered a path to immense social power, but it was a life that demanded total sacrifice. Many recruits were young girls, some volunteering and others chosen from across the kingdom for their physical strength and resilient spirit. Once they were initiated, their training was both brutal and relentless. They were taught to master extreme pain, navigating obstacle courses lined with acacia thorns, and practicing with real blades. Each warrior swore an oath of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king, whom they regarded as their husband. Their discipline was absolute. On the battlefield, their presence was terrifying. They wore simple tunics with braided sashes, but their weapons were deadly and effective. While armed with European muskets, they were also masters of close combat, expertly wielding heavy, machete-like swords and war clubs. Perhaps their most powerful weapon, however, was their reputation for ferocity. They were known for their utter fearlessness, charging directly into enemy formations and fighting with a brutality that stunned even veteran European soldiers. 19th century accounts from French officers reveal a mixture of horror and grudging admiration. One officer wrote with unease of witnessing an Aguji warrior rush forward, kill an enemy soldier, and then calmly wipe her blade before rejoining the fight. These were not symbolic displays. These were frontline soldiers, their purpose being to defend their kingdom and eliminate its enemies. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars in the 1890s, the Aguji fought with fierce determination against the technologically superior French colonial forces. Despite being outgunned, they executed daring night raids and deadly ambushes, defending their capital street by street. Their courage and tenacity compelled French commanders to rethink both their tactics and their long-held assumptions about gender in warfare. The kingdom of Dahomey was eventually defeated and colonized by France, but the legend of the Aguji endured. They had existed as a powerful, autonomous force within a deeply patriarchal society, serving as advisors to kings and shaping the destiny of their nation with blades in hand. Their legacy remains a powerful testament to a time and place where an army of women served as the unbreakable shield of a kingdom. The Aguji of Dahomey were a formal, state-sanctioned army of women. Yet, history is also filled with singular figures, legendary warriors whose individual stories shine brightly. For one such tale, we travel to the war-torn lands of late 12th century Japan during the intense civil conflict known as the Genpei War. It is here that the story of a woman named Tomo Gozan rides through blood and legend. Tomo Gozan was an honorable geisha, a female warrior of the samurai class. She was far from a symbolic figure or a quiet consort. She was a skilled commander, a master of the bow, and a swordsman of fearsome ability. Her story is most famously captured in the Tale of the Hike, a classic of Japanese literature detailing the war between the Minamoto and Taira clans. The epic describes her as a person of great beauty, with fair skin and long hair. The next sentence, however, reveals her true essence. She was a powerful archer and a swordswoman worth 1,000 warriors, prepared to face any demon or god. She served the warlord Minamoto no Yoshinaka and was among his most trusted commanders. She did not direct troops from the rear, but was deep in the fighting, reportedly leading 1,000 cavalry and building a reputation for her immense courage and calm composure under fire. In a society with rigid patriarchal codes, Tomo was an exception, a woman who led men and excelled in the deadly arts of combat. Her most famous moment occurred at the Battle of Owazu in 1184. With their forces shattered and defeat all but certain, her lord Yoshinaka ordered her to flee, believing it would be a dishonor for him to die with a woman at his side. Wishing to take one last great enemy for her master, she instead rode into a group of 30 samurai. She challenged their champion, a famously powerful warrior, and with incredible force, unhorsed him, pinned him to the ground, and took his head with her dagger. After this, she cast off her armor and vanished into the chaos. Tomo's fate after the battle is a mystery lost to folklore. Some tales suggest she was defeated and forced to become the consort of another warrior. Others say she disappeared into the eastern provinces, never to be seen again. Another poignant version of the story claims she became a Buddhist nun, spending the rest of her life praying for the soul of her fallen master. Regardless of the truth, the legend of Tomo Gozan persisted. Her story was kept alive in no theater, woodblock prints, and poetry, making her a powerful symbol of female strength in Japanese culture. She embodies the ideal of the warrior, who is both graceful and deadly, beautiful and utterly ferocious. In a world bound by the strict codes of Bushido, Tomo Gozen created her own legend. She fought not just for her lord, but for her right to exist as she was, a warrior of unmatched skill, whose story would outlive the very emperors and shoguns of her era. From the world of the samurai, our journey takes us to the misty shores of 1st century Britain, a land struggling under Roman occupation. Here we find the story of a queen and mother who was driven to rebellion, not by training, but by cruelty. She was a flame-haired Celtic queen who united the tribes in a firestorm of vengeance, so great it almost expelled the Roman Empire from the island. Her name was Boudica. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe in what is now eastern England. He had ruled as a client king, keeping a fragile peace with the Roman invaders. To preserve that peace after his death, he named the Roman emperor as a heir to his kingdom, along with his daughters. Rome chose to ignore this gesture of goodwill. After he died, Roman officials seized his lands, subjected Boudica to a public flogging, and, as the historian Tacitus recorded, brutally assaulted her daughters. This profound humiliation was meant to crush the Iceni spirit, but instead it ignited a rebellion. In the year 60 or 61 CE, Boudica's grief transformed into a powerful rage. She rallied her people and created an alliance with neighboring tribes who were also tired of Roman oppression. Roman histories describe her as a charismatic and terrifying war leader, not a distant figurehead. They tell of her riding into battle in a chariot with a spear in her hand, her long red hair flowing behind her as she called her people to war. She was, at once, a queen, a priestess, and a force of pure fury. Her rebellion struck the Romans with shocking speed and violence. Her army, numbering in the tens of thousands, first fell upon the Roman colony of Camulodunum, today's Colchester, and burned it to the ground. They then marched on Londinium, the busy port that would become London, and destroyed it. The Roman city of Verulamium was next. In just a few months, Boudica's forces had killed an estimated 70,000 Romans and their sympathizers, leaving behind a trail of ash and terror. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning in Wales when the revolt began. He rushed his legions back to face the crisis. Though he was vastly outnumbered by Boudica's tribal host, Suetonius was a brilliant military tactician. He carefully chose his ground, drawing the Britons into a battle in a narrow area that negated their numbers and favored the discipline of his legionaries. The final battle was a tragic and brutal affair. The powerful Celtic charge was met by the unyielding Roman shield wall and the methodical work of the gladius, the Roman short sword. In the end, Roman discipline and superior formation defeated the passionate but less organized Britons. The rebellion was ended in a single bloody afternoon. Facing capture and a humiliating parade through Rome, Boudica made her last choice. It is believed she took poison, preferring death to submission. While her uprising failed, her legacy was just beginning. Roman historians depicted her as a fearsome barbarian queen whose courage was undeniable. For later generations of Britons, she became a national hero, a timeless symbol of defiance against foreign rule and the incredible strength of a woman with nothing left to lose. We now leave the shores of Roman Britain, traveling across continents and centuries to the vast, windswept heartland of the Mongol Empire. Another woman commanded respect, not with a sword or bow, but with her bare hands. She was a princess who embarrassed other princes and terrified warriors, not through political games, but through sheer physical strength. Her name was Kutalun, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan himself. Born around the year 1260, Kutalun was the daughter of Kaidu, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan, and a major rival for leadership of the Mongol Empire. In a culture that prized martial skill above all, Kutalun was raised as a warrior. But her greatest and most exceptional talent was for wrestling, a highly respected and competitive Mongol sport. Her strength and skill in wrestling became legendary. According to accounts from the Persian historian Rashid al-Din and the traveler Marco Polo, Kutalun made a public vow to marry only a man who could best her in a wrestling match. Any suitor who lost the challenge had to forfeit 100 horses to her. Dozens of proud and powerful men accepted her challenge. Princes and warriors from all over the empire, certain of their own strength. One by one, they were thrown to the ground, leaving both humiliated and poorer. Through these victories, Kutalun is said to have gathered a personal herd of 10,000 horses, making her not only a champion but also one of the wealthiest and most independent women of the steppes. Kutalun was more than just an athlete. She was a vital military leader in her father's campaigns. She fought beside him in battle, commanding her own troops and often charging into the fight herself. Marco Polo wrote that she could ride into enemy lines, grab a warrior as easily as a hawk grabs a bird, and carry him away. Her father, Kaidu, trusted her judgment so much that he often preferred her military advice to that of his male generals, and even thought of naming her as his successor to the Khanate. Such an unprecedented level of influence for a woman was not without opposition. The pressure on her to marry and secure an alliance was immense, but Kutalun refused to be a political bargaining chip. She was determined to forge her own destiny on her own terms. While later histories sometimes tried to diminish her story by turning her into a simple romantic figure, the contemporary accounts are clear. Kutalun was a real and powerful force of nature. In the center of the most famously male-dominated empire in history, she rose to the highest levels of power not because she was granted permission, but because no one was strong enough to stand in her way. From the wrestling grounds of the Mongol Empire, we return to the battlefields of medieval Europe. Here we find a different kind of power, born not of royal lineage or intense physical training, but of unshakable faith. At a time when women were forbidden to wear armor, lead armies, or speak in the councils of men, a French teenager did all three. Her name was Joan of Arc, and her story is among the most unlikely and inspiring in history. Born in 1412 to a peasant family in the village of illiterate girl living during the darkest period of the 100 Years' War, France was near collapse, its armies beaten and much of its land under English occupation. But Joan claimed she was different. From a young age, she said she heard divine voices, those of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They entrusted her with a sacred and seemingly impossible task. Her mission had two parts. First, to drive the English invaders from her country, and second, to ensure the uncrowned heir. The Dauphin Charles was officially crowned king at the cathedral in Reims. It was a bold claim, one that should have led to her being dismissed as either mad or a heretic. Instead, her conviction was so strong it won her a meeting with the desperate Dauphin. The court was doubtful, and theologians questioned her for weeks, testing her faith. Yet, she somehow convinced them. In her, they saw a purity, charisma, and a divine certainty that offered a rare glimmer of hope. In an act of desperation, They provided her with armor, a banner, and sent her to the besieged city of. She led from the front, rallying her troops, helping plan attacks, and bravely facing enemy fire. With her charismatic leadership, the French spirit was reignited, and against all odds, they broke the English siege. The victory was seen as a miracle, and Joan became a national hero overnight, forever known as the Maid of. After this incredible success, Joan led the French army to a series of more victories, clearing a path to the city of Reims, just as her visions had promised. She stood by Charles's side as he was officially crowned King Charles VII of France. She had achieved her impossible mission, but her astounding rise would be followed by a swift and tragic fall. In 1430, she was captured in battle by Burgundian soldiers who were allied with the English. They sold her to their English masters, who were determined to crush the living symbol of French defiance. She was put on trial by a pro-English church court and charged with heresy, witchcraft, and, most notably, the crime of wearing men's clothing. At only 19 years old, Joan of Arc was found guilty and burned at the stake. Her death did not silence her. It turned her from a hero into a martyr, and eventually a saint, her legend only growing with time. Joan of Arc's power came from a divine vision of a nation's future. Our story now takes us to a warrior who fought for the opposite reason, to defend a sacred past from the overwhelming tide of a new era. We travel to Japan in the late 1860s, a time of violent change as the age of the samurai was ending. It is here that a young woman named Nakano Takeko made her mark on history as one of the last true Anabugeisha, a female warrior of the samurai tradition. Born in 1847 to a respected family of samurai officials in the Aizu domain, Takeko was educated in classical calligraphy and poetry. She was also rigorously trained in martial arts and showed exceptional skill with the naginata, a bladed polearm. The naginata was a weapon traditionally used by women of the samurai class, as its long reach could keep swordsmen and charging horses at a distance. Under her master's guidance, Takeko became a formidable warrior, her skill equal to that of the best men in her domain. By her early 20s, she was both a warrior and an instructor, teaching martial arts to other women. Her lessons would soon be put to the ultimate test. In 1868, the Boshin War began, a civil conflict that pitted the modernizing imperial forces against the traditional Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 250 years. Takeko's home domain of Isu was one of the last and most loyal strongholds of the old shogunate and became a key target for the imperial army. As imperial forces besieged Aizu Castle, women were not officially permitted to join the domain's army. Unwilling to stand aside while her world was being destroyed, Nakano Takeko took matters into her own hands. She gathered a small group of other female warriors to form an unofficial unit that became known as the Jeijutai, or the Women's Army. Clad in traditional armor and wielding their deadly naginata, Takeko and her small band of women charged headlong into the fray. At the Battle of Aizu, they launched a counterattack against imperial troops who were armed with modern, far superior rifles. The sight of these female warriors charging with polearms was so shocking that the imperial soldiers were said to have hesitated, allowing the women to cut down several of them in hand-to-hand combat. Tragically, courage alone could not defeat bullets. During one of these charges, Nakano Takeko was shot in the chest, mortally wounded, and knowing the end was near, she made one final request: to prevent the enemy from taking her head as a trophy. a common practice on the samurai battlefield, she asked her sister, Yiko, to behead her. Her sister fulfilled this solemn duty and buried Takako's head at the foot of a tree at a nearby temple. Today, a monument stands in Izu in her honor. Nakano Takako's story is a poignant and powerful one. She was not fighting for a new world, but for the honor of a dying one. She stands as a symbol of the samurai code of Bushido, a warrior who chose to face impossible odds and die with her traditions, rather than live in a world without them. We leave the age of blades and honor codes and travel now into the brutal, mechanized inferno of the 20th century. In the smoldering ruins of the Eastern Front during World War II, a new kind of warrior emerged. She fought not with a sword or a spear, but with a scoped rifle and a deadly, silent precision. One name, in particular, sent a chill down the spines of German soldiers. That name was Ludmila Pavlichenko, and to her enemies she was known simply as Lady Death. She was the most successful female sniper in recorded history. Ludmila was not a lifelong soldier. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, she was a bright and competitive university student, studying history and working at a local factory. In her spare time, she joined a shooting club, where she discovered she was a natural marksman, consistently earning awards for her accuracy. She was an ordinary young woman with an extraordinary talent, living a peaceful life that was about to be shattered. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ludmila, then 24, was among the first to volunteer for the Red Army. The recruitment officer initially tried to steer her towards becoming a nurse, but she refused. She presented her marksmanship certificates and insisted on a combat role. Her determination paid off, and she was assigned to the infantry as a sniper. Deployed to the front lines, she saw action during the brutal sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol. Here, she earned her fearsome reputation. The life of a sniper was one of extreme hardship and immense patience. It required spending countless hours, motionless, perfectly camouflaged in the mud and freezing terrain, waiting for a single, perfect moment to take a shot. It demanded nerves of steel and an absolute mastery of the cold calculus of warfare. Ludmila excelled in this deadly art. Her targets were not just ordinary foot soldiers. She specialized in hunting high-value targets, enemy officers, machine gun nests, and mortar crews. Most impressively, she engaged in 36 counter-sniping duels, tense, one-on-one battles of wits and skill against enemy snipers, and she won every single one of them. By the end of her service on the front lines, her tally stood at 309 confirmed kills. Her record became so legendary that the Soviet High Command decided she was too valuable to risk in further combat. In 1942, she was pulled from the front and sent on a diplomatic tour of the United States, Canada, and Great Britain to help rally support for a second front in Europe. She became the first Soviet citizen to be welcomed at the White House by a U.S. president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and she formed an unlikely friendship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. After the war, Ludmila completed her history degree at Kyiv University and became a historian and researcher for the Soviet Navy. She trained future generations of Soviet snipers, passing on her hard-won knowledge, though she was forever haunted by the trauma of the war. Her legacy as Lady Death was secure. She remains a national hero in Russia and Ukraine, a powerful testament to the fact that in the crucible of war, courage and skill know no gender. For every famous warrior woman whose name has survived the centuries, a Boudica, a Tomo Gazan, a Ludmila Pavlichenko. There are countless others whose stories have slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. Their tales were often ignored by the male scribes who chronicled their eras, their contributions downplayed, or their identities erased entirely. But make no mistake, they were there all along, across every continent and in every century, their silence in our history books not being a reflection of their absence, but of our failure to record them. Consider the Trung sisters of 1st century Vietnam. Trung Trac and Trung Ni were noblewomen who led a massive rebellion against Chinese Han dynasty rule. They rallied thousands of followers, drove out their occupiers, and ruled as co-queens of an independent state for 3 years. They rode elephants into battle and are remembered today as national heroes in Vietnam, with temples and festivals dedicated to their memory. Yet, in many global history texts, their monumental struggle is a mere footnote. Or consider Ja Asantewaa, the queen mother of the Ashanti Empire, in what is now Ghana. In 1900, when the British governor demanded that her people surrender their sacred golden stool, the symbol of the Ashanti's soul and sovereignty, the male chiefs hesitated. It was Ja Asantewaa who rose and delivered a fiery speech, shaming the men for their cowardice and vowing to lead the fight herself. She led the Ashanti rebellion, becoming the commander-in-chief in one of the last major wars against British colonialism in Africa. There is growing evidence for the Viking shield maidens, long thought to be pure myth, while perhaps not as common as modern fiction suggests. Archaeological discoveries of female graves containing full sets of weapons, armor, and war horses confirm that some Viking women lived and were buried with the full honors of a warrior. They were not just wives and mothers. Some were fighters, their stories now being pieced together from bone and buried steel. In the American Southwest, there was Lozon, a skilled warrior and respected prophet of the Chihen Chiricahua Apache. She fought alongside her brother, the great chief Victorio, and later with Geronimo. She was said to be able to use her spiritual power to locate the enemy, and was considered as brave and strategically brilliant as any male warrior in the band. These women, and thousands like them, fought for a myriad of reasons: to protect their families, to defend their culture from invaders, to avenge a wrong, or simply because it was their duty. They were queens and peasants, prophets and soldiers. They came from every corner of the globe, and their collective stories shatter the persistent and inaccurate myth that war has always been an exclusively male domain. Today, their legacy is slowly being reclaimed. Historians and archaeologists are uncovering their stories, giving voice to these forgotten figures. Each rediscovered name is a powerful reminder that history is not just what was written down, it is also about what was erased. These women did not fight to be remembered in videos like this one. They fought to be respected. And now, at last, the world is beginning to listen. If you've enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes to support our exploration of these quiet corners of history. We have heard the stories of warriors, their names and deeds echoing down to us through the clash of steel and the pages of history. Now, let us quiet the battlefield and listen for a different kind of echo, the forgotten sounds of the ancient world. Our journey now turns to music, an art form that in antiquity was rarely just for entertainment. It was a sacred language, a form of ritual technology, and a direct line to the gods. Our first stop is in the cradle of civilization itself, ancient Mesopotamia. In the heart of what is now modern-day Iraq, in the sun-baked plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Music was woven into the very fabric of life, and no instrument was more central to this world than the lyre. Emerging from the great Sumerian city of yore more than 4,500 years ago, the lyre is one of the world's oldest known stringed instruments, a beautiful and sophisticated tool for creating sound in a world that was still learning how to write. The lyres of yore were not simple wooden frames. They were breathtaking works of art, discovered in the 1920s in the royal tombs of the city. The most famous of these is the magnificent bull lyre. Its soundbox is crafted in the shape of a bull, its head covered in gold leaf, its eyes and intricate beard fashioned from precious blue lapis lazuli. The bull was a powerful symbol of strength and divinity, and its presence on the instrument suggests that its music was considered a sacred, powerful force. Played by plucking the strings with the fingers or a small pick called a plectrum, the Mesopotamian lyre produced a gentle, resonant tone, similar to a small harp, though we can never know exactly what ancient melodies sounded like. Clay tablets, inscribed with an early form of musical notation, give us tantalizing clues. Scholars believe the Sumerians used a heptatonic, or seven-note, scale, a structure remarkably similar to the one that underpins most modern Western music. This music was everywhere. In the towering ziggurat temples, the sound of the lyre accompanied hymns and prayers offered to deities like Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Its notes were thought to please the gods and maintain cosmic balance. In the royal courts, court musicians played the lyre to entertain kings and recount epic tales. It was the soundtrack to both power and piety. The lyre also played a crucial role in the passage between life and death. In funerary rites, its mournful tones were believed to soothe the spirits of the dead and help guide their souls into the afterlife. To the Sumerians, the lyre was not just an instrument. It was a voice that could speak to both gods and ghosts. The musicians who played these instruments were highly respected members of society. Many were female priestesses or trained court performers who memorized vast repertoires of complex songs, passing them down through oral tradition for generations. In the soft, twanging echoes of their lyres, we can hear one of humanity's first attempts to capture the intangible, to give order and beauty to the air itself, and to create a sound worthy of eternity. While the Mesopotamian lyre sang its gentle praises to the gods, another instrument in another land screamed, wept, and danced with the untamed passions of the human heart. We travel now to ancient Greece, a world that understood music not just as sound, but as ethos, a moral and emotional force capable of shaping the very soul. And no instrument embodied the wild, primal edge of that force more than the aloes. The aloes was not a gentle flute. It was a powerful, double-piped reed instrument, and its sound was piercing, insistent, and deeply emotional. To the Greeks, music was a world of duality. On one side was the lyre, the instrument of the god Apollo, representing harmony, reason, and intellectual order. On the other side was the aloes, the instrument of Dionysus, the god of wine, ritual madness, and ecstatic release. The lyre was for the mind. The aloes was for the gut. The instrument itself consisted of two separate pipes, usually made from wood, bone, or ivory, each fitted with its own reed. An aloes player, or olite, would play both pipes simultaneously, producing a rich, buzzing, and complex sound, closer in timbre to a modern oboe or even a bagpipe than a simple flute. This required incredible lung capacity, and a technique known as circular breathing, where the player inhales through the nose while still pushing air out from their puffed-out cheeks, allowing them to play a continuous, unbroken melody. This physical exertion was immense. The player's face would contort, their cheeks ballooning with air, a sight that was sometimes mocked by Greek satirists. Yet skilled aulets were highly respected and sought-after performers. Their ability to sustain a note and weave complex, overlapping melodies was a mark of true mastery. Their music was not intended for quiet contemplation. It was designed to stir the blood. The aulos was the engine of Greek public life in the great stone amphitheaters. It provided the musical accompaniment for the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, its wailing tones heightening the sorrow, suspense, and catharsis of the drama. On the battlefield, its blaring voice kept hoplite soldiers marching in disciplined step, cutting through the chaos of war. And during Dionysian festivals, its hypnotic, driving rhythm would propel dancers into a state of trance-like frenzy, dissolving the boundaries between the self and the divine. The philosopher Plato famously had a complicated relationship with the instrument. In his vision of a perfect society, described in the Republic, he argued for banning the aulos. He considered its sound too emotionally overwhelming, too capable of stirring up passions that were disruptive to a well-ordered state. He much preferred the intellectual clarity of the lyre. The very fact that Plato considered an instrument a potential threat to society shows just how seriously the Greeks took the power of music. The aulos was the sound of raw, unfiltered humanity. It was not mathematically perfect or calmly beautiful. It was the sound of mourning, the shriek of fury, the pulse of celebration, and the cry of war. It was the sound of life in all its messy, passionate glory. From the ecstatic cries of the Greek aulos, our final journey takes us to a place of quiet contemplation and profound philosophical depth, ancient China. Here, in the serene studios of scholars and the tranquil halls of emperors, music was more than art or entertainment. It was a pathway to cosmic harmony, a form of meditation, and a tool for cultivating the self. This ideal is perfectly captured in two of China's most iconic instruments, the guqin and the guzheng. The guqin is the elder and more revered of the two, an instrument with a history stretching back over 3,000 years. It is a deceptively simple-looking zither consisting of a long, narrow body of polished wood, with 7 silk strings stretched across its fretless surface. To the untrained ear, its sound is whisper-quiet and subtle, a vocabulary of soft plucks, gentle slides, and ethereal harmonics that can evoke the sound of wind through pines or raindrops falling on an ancient temple roof. But to Chinese scholars and sages, the guqin was a universe in miniature. Its sounds were not just notes. They were reflections of the balance between heaven and earth. Playing the guqin was a deeply personal and spiritual practice. It was not meant for performance or for pleasing a crowd, but for self-cultivation. The great philosopher Confucius was said to be a master of the instrument, believing that its quiet discipline could purify the heart, calm the mind, and foster moral character. To play the guqin was to engage in a conversation with one's own soul. In contrast stands the guqin's younger, brighter, and more sociable cousin. With 16 to 21 or more strings, each with its own movable bridge, the guqin was built for performance. Musicians pluck its strings with small picks attached to their fingers, creating rich melodies and dramatic flowing glissandos that can shimmer like a waterfall or thunder like galloping horses. Its voice is loud, expressive, and designed to capture the ear of an audience. Where the Guqin whispered philosophy in a scholar's private study, the Guzhang sang epic tales in the bustling halls of the imperial palace. It was the instrument of choice for banquets, folk ensembles, and theatrical performances. Its music was narrative, capable of painting vivid sonic pictures and conveying a wide spectrum of emotion, from the sorrow of a parting lover to the excitement of a victorious battle. Traditionally, these two instruments occupied different social spaces. The quiet, introspective Guqin became associated with male scholars and the Confucian ideal of the gentleman's age. The more extroverted and performative Guzhang, particularly in later dynasties, became increasingly associated with female musicians whose skill and artistry were celebrated in courtly life. And so, we end our long journey here with the sound of vibrating silk strings from ancient China. From the powdered faces of medieval Europe to the disciplined ranks of the Persian Immortals, to the defiant courage of warrior women, and finally to the forgotten melodies of antiquity, we see a common thread. Appearance, strength, and sound were never just what they seemed on the surface. They were languages used to express power, virtue, and humanity's deepest ideas about its place in the world. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Until next time, from all of us at Medieval Nocturnes, we wish you a peaceful and restful night.